and welcome to this edition of the NLF Imaginary Lines Book Club 2020. We're very excited to be here, and we hope you are too. We're going to be speaking some more with the author Elizabeth Stewart today about her book, Blue Gold. We'll talk about her approaches to the writing process, how she thinks about her characters, and about Blue Gold's connections to the real world. Before we introduce our speaker for today, we would like to go over some housekeeping rules with the audience. You can ask your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. In fact, if you already have your questions ready, please feel free to type them in the box right away. We'll discuss them around 40 minutes into the session. If you raise your virtual hand, we would not be able to attend to your question. Hence, we recommend that you use the Q&A box to share your questions with us. We will be putting up a few polls and prompts on the chat box during the webinar in order to engage with you further, and we would love for you to participate in the same. And now we're very happy to introduce Elizabeth Stewart, the author of Blue Gold. Elizabeth lives in Vancouver, Canada. Her novel Blue Gold explores the human cost of smartphones through the lives of 3 teenagers on 3 different continents. Blue Gold has been translated into half a dozen languages and was the recipient of the 2014 Eric Hoffer Award. Her first YA novel, The Lynching of Louis Sam, received the Best Mystery and Best Historical Novel prizes at the 2013 Canadian Children's Book Centre Awards and was listed in the 2013 White Ravens Collection International Youth Library, Munich. Elizabeth was a screenwriter. Her TV movie, Luna, Spirit of the Whale, about a stray killer whale who was instrumental in restoring cultural pride to the youth of a Canadian First Nation, has been screened around the world. Her feature film, The Boathouse, will release in 2021. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Hi, nice to be here.
It's lovely to have you with us.
Thanks.
When we met Elizabeth for the last time, on our session, the first session of the book club on November 20th, for the members of our audience who weren't with us then, it was at a highly inconvenient time for her. It was at 5 a.m. But we're so glad that Elizabeth was able to do it with us. And so we're hoping that today yeah, today it's much more convenient. It's what, 8:30 p.m. your time, right?
That's right. Yes, Friday night. So
Excellent.
You're ahead of me there. Yes.
Right. So Elizabeth, before we started the session, I thought we could just get an idea of whether the members of our audience have been able to read the book. So I'm just going to launch a quick poll for us to see how we're doing with regard to the reading of the book. We'll keep it on for about 30 seconds for people to vote. Right, 30 seconds. Okay, so there you go. We have about, a lot of the audience has not read the book, but 18% are midway through and 9% have finished. So hopefully at the end of the session, we will enthuse all of our members of our audience to read the book. So Elizabeth, we thought we'd recap to the previous session where we had asked the audience a question about a 4th character from India. But before we get to that, and since we have a lot of people with us who have not read the book and who are not terribly familiar with it, we thought we could play a trailer of the book that the publisher has put together.
Sure.
Okay, excellent. So can we have a member of the team put up the trailer, please? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the screen share. That was a nicely put together trailer. It really sets the mood for the book itself.
Yes, it's very dramatic, certainly. Yes. Well, it's a serious subject. So,
Fair
yeah.
enough. Yeah.
Yes.
When we concluded the first session, Elizabeth, I'm sure you recall that we had put out a question for the members of our audience. We put out a question for the members of our audience where we'd said that, or we'd asked if there had to be a fourth character from India in Blue Gold, who would this character be? And what is the issue that this character would represent? We're going to have our members put out the same message on the chat box as well. But if we have members of the audience who would like to share their thoughts on this question, we'd love to hear from you. We'll give it half a minute to see if we have any thoughts on this so that we could discuss it. And Elizabeth would also get to know how you're thinking about the story.
I'm fascinated to know, actually, who that character might be.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I hope we get a few nice responses.
Right. Any guesses, Karthika? Who?
I think it'll obviously be someone who will have to take this connection forward, right? The equation between young people and the phones, smartphones, social media. I know that it's catching on quite a bit in India, especially with TikTok and those sort of apps. So we might get some responses from there. Right. We have a response from a member of the audience saying a girl from a government school who aspires to want to do more with her life. She insists that her father buy her a smartphone to improve her social status, be a social media influencer. She sees it as her ticket out of poverty. Thank you so much, Shivali, for your response.
Interesting.
Is that something that you've thought about or that you've come across at all, Elizabeth, in any of the research that you've done about smartphones, young people?
Well, curiously enough, I've just recently have seen a documentary, perhaps you're familiar with, called The Social Dilemma. Do you know it?
Yes.
You're familiar with it? Yes, and it's probably available on Netflix there as it is around the world.
Yeah.
And it takes what I did in Blue Gold many strides forward into the real social impact of and political impact of social media. I mean, in Blue Gold, the social impact is in the life of one girl in Vancouver who makes a mistake by posting a photo that gets loose. But we can see now on the global scale that the power of social media is much greater than that. And I would highly recommend that documentary to anyone who's watching. It's an example.
It's a compelling watch. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's an interesting thought the member of the audience put forward about I think she's suggesting that this young girl in India might need the smartphone for her social standing, but also her economic standing, right? So she could become an influencer. So in itself, it is an economic tool, which is true as well. I mean, it was never my intention in Blue Gold to suggest we shouldn't use electronics. Electronics are just electronics, and the internet is a brilliant tool, but is also open to horrible abuse. So it's a question of finding regulations and using our own common sense to regulate our use of the medium.
Right. Another thing that also struck me actually when I was thinking about this question was now with a lot of online schooling, a lot of children from across the country don't have access to physical school, and therefore they end up using their parents' smartphones to sort of sit in on their classes. But that's another way,
Yes.
maybe that, yeah.
Yes.
Thought.
Well, and it's been the case for a good decade here at least in my city. I don't know about the rest of North America, where students are kind of expected to have a smartphone with them because it's a computer. And they're allowed to have them in class as a research tool, right? So.
Okay, all right. And how old? I mean, at what age group are these?
High school. So it would be ages 13 and up.
Right.
I don't know about elementary school, what we call elementary school here. I don't think so, but I know that in high school classes, like a history class or, some place where you need to have research at hand, they are used as an educational tool.
Oh, that's interesting. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I know we had a bunch of interesting questions that came up from the audience in the last session, and I thought we could sort of go back to some of those questions to start off today. Last time we had a question from Priyadarshini Gogoi, who said that all the main characters in the book are young women. Is there a reason you chose for them all to be joined by gender as well? And is there a certain message or truth behind this connection?
It's a very good question. I think starting with as I explained last time, my very beginning point in this whole process was looking at human rights violations in the Eastern Congo due to mining. And what really caught my attention and I found so horrific was the use of rape as a weapon of war, as a way to dominate these populations. And that obviously, it can affect boys and men as well, but largely that's targeting girls and women. So that was the starting point. And then I knew I wanted to have, once the idea developed and it became this triangulation of the girl working in the factory and the end user, because there'd been so much in local news in Canada, two horrific instances of young girls posting photos of themselves that then fell into the hands of horrible people who tormented them, basically. So again, it was more of a female vulnerability. And I guess from there, it just made sense to make it all girls. So Laiping was a girl as well.
Right.
And that is true, from my understanding, and quite typical of a lot of village girls in China want to go and help their families. So they migrate to the cities to work in these factories. And it is true that there are thousands of young women working in those factories for that reason.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah, but it would be very interesting to contemplate the same story with 3 boys or young men.
Yeah, exactly. It's what I was thinking about. I'm so glad. Thank you, Priyadarshini, for asking us that question.
Yeah. Actually, in the book, I do talk about Sylvie's brother, who has been deeply affected by the whole, Olivier, who has been deeply affected by Coltan as well. And even in Fiona's story, in Vancouver, the young girl who has the new smartphone, she winds up blaming a boy she was interested in for letting this photo loose on the internet. And it turns out that he wasn't responsible for it at all. And in fact, he became somewhat victimized, people accusing him of having done this when he hadn't done it. So I think there were ways, and in Laiping's story, also she has a friend who is introducing her to some of the human rights issues, who introduces her to Sylvie through the internet, the African girl. And he winds up paying a price for that as well. So I guess in some ways I did try to involve some young men there as well.
That's true. There was visibility of men in the narrative as well. That was nice to see. Yeah. So speaking of that, Elizabeth, when we talked about the characters in your previous session, and you talked about when you're crafting your characters, you talk about how it's important for the character to undergo that journey where the character realizes, what do I want versus what do I need? And you said that that's an important step in creating a narrative and in building characters. So can you walk us through a little bit about how you created these characters and also how to then make a narrative arc for them so that you have an interesting set of events for each of them across these 3 different geographies? When you were writing it at some point, at what point did you think that you want to bring them all together?
Okay, so why don't I answer that last part first? At what point did I want to bring them all together?
Sure.
As I was saying, initially I intended only to write about Coltan in Africa and about the effects it has on a family that's forced to flee the country because of the fighting over this precious mineral. But I quickly became aware that it needed the contrast of the end user to really bring home what we consumers in the Western world, at least, take for granted. That it really required this Fiona, the girl in Vancouver, to become aware of the pain and suffering that went into the making of this cell phone. And then Laiping was the third story to come in, because I quickly realized that was the missing link in this chain, that there was some suffering going on there as well. There were human rights abuses going on at these factories too. She happens to work in China, but there are factories around the world with similarly unpleasant and dangerous working conditions. So that's how that triangulation came about. In terms of the story arcs, that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the difference between what a character wants at the beginning and what a character needs to learn about themselves or to learn about the world in order to live a more enlightened and fulfilling life. That's the character arc, going from one to the other. And that generally gives one the narrative spine in a story. So I guess Fiona in Vancouver has the most obvious arc, because she's the least conscious at the beginning. All she wants, as so many of us do, is the latest shiniest piece of technology that will do the greatest things. And she isn't really thinking at all about where that came from. So hers is the easiest to understand, I think, her character arc, that she wants a new smartphone, but she needs to learn the process through which that phone came to her and the people who suffered, and what she can do as an individual to try to make a difference, to use her power as a consumer to insist that human rights are observed in the making of these products. How's that?
Yes, with Fiona,
Yeah.
that was a clear arc. And so with
Yes.
Sylvie and Laiping, then it was obviously was it a coming to terms with their circumstances, escaping their circumstances? Was that sort of a driving force?
For Laiping, that's true. I think she was very excited. I think I said last time, I think that Laiping probably has not the most emphatic character arc of the three of them. But you could say that she was a naive young girl living in this rural village. And she was dazzled by the bright lights of the city. And she heard all these stories from her cousin, who had already gone ahead to the manufacturing city and sent all these letters home saying how wonderful that life was. So she was a bit dazzled by that, and wanted to experience that herself. So that's what she wanted, but I suppose what she needed was to learn there's a price that one pays for that too. Sylvie has perhaps a little more subtle arc, and I think it has more to do with her personal character, that for those of you who've read the book, you know that she has suffered a scar across her face, and she's highly self-conscious about it, doesn't want to be seen. So her solution is, she's living in this horrible refugee camp anyway. Her solution is just to hide away from the world and not show herself. So that is her desire, to hide. But what she learns through a young doctor who works in that camp, who persuades her to let her take her picture with a cell phone, again, a positive use of a cell phone, and put it on the internet to bring attention to the abuses in the Congo. So what she learns in that process is that she needs to stand up and be counted, and that she has more power than she realizes.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay.
Now, since you also know that you're really actively involved in screenwriting at this point, and you've written novels as well, so how differently do you approach the writing process or the craft for both of these? And what do you personally identify with more?
Well, I've been a screenwriter much, much longer than I've been a novelist. So I must say that comes more naturally to me. Writing novels is really, really hard. I discovered. Writing a good screenplay is hard too, but I guess, it's really hard for me to tell. Is that just my bias, that it comes more naturally to me to write a screenplay than a novel? I have heard some novelists say that they found it hard to write a screenplay, but I really think the novel is a very challenging form. The key difference, one key difference between the two, aside from obviously the screenplay relying much more on visuals and on dialogue than the novel does. The novel is much more internal. The whole thing about a screenplay is to be as tight and as trim as possible. For a feature film, let's say, you have about 100 pages to tell a story in, and every word counts, every moment counts. But with a novel, it's the opposite. When I first took a stab at writing my first novel, Louis Sam, I found I was being too tight with it. I was just being too condensed with it. And I had to retrain myself to open up and become expansive and let it breathe and explore and be internal. I think both of my novels probably read a little bit more like a screenplay than, perhaps a more traditional, very internal novel. There's lots of dialogue in each of them. They're probably pretty visual. So that is where my screenwriting has influenced these two particular novels. But I think there's an argument to be made that a lot of novels, a lot of contemporary novels have tended to lean more towards the screenplay than earlier novels that were perhaps a little more literary or intellectual or internal. It's an interesting debate.
Right, which actually leads me into my next question, which is about the adaptation of books for the screen. The case for books that most people make for reading is that it helps you develop the power of your imagination because you're reading these words, you're forming pictures in your mind, and you can go into a lot of detail when you're describing a particular object in text. So how does that translate to the screen? What does it do for developing one's imagination or going into detail when you see that translated on screen? So what are your thoughts on that as somebody who's straddled both worlds?
Interesting. Well, I suppose one might conclude from that description that the screenplay is just prescribed, or the screenplay or the film or the television program that results from the screenplay is prescribed and doesn't require a lot of imagination on the part of the viewer. But a well-written screenplay relies very much on subtext. So you don't want to be too much on the nose. You want to let your characters be themselves, behave as they would behave, and leave it to the viewer to make conclusions about that character. The character arcs is an interesting model. Let's say we were doing a half-hour television program about Fiona, and she wants that cell phone. So if you can imagine the scenes that we would see with her in the beginning of that half hour, it would be about nagging her mom and dad. You gotta have it. I gotta have it. All the other kids have it. I have to be in with the in crowd. Whatever she's saying is on the surface is her want, but the astute viewer and a skilled writer will make it clear to the audience, even in that early scene, there's something wrong here. She wants this, she's missing something, right? So I think in that respect, there should be room for imagination in a screenplay or in the end product, the film or the television program. Another big difference is that the novelist works largely alone. I mean, I worked with the support of a wonderful book editor and a highly supportive publisher who gave me feedback and helped me shape the thing all along. But a screenwriter is only the first step in the production of a film or television show. Sooner or later, the screenwriter has to give that over to the director and the cast and the production department, the set designers, the set decorators, the props people, the costumers, all the people who fill out all that role. And by their very definition, all of those people will change the story in some small way. Each of them will bring their own take on the story. And that's a positive. When that system is working well, that's a positive thing. It enriches the production enormously and gives it greater depth. And we've all seen productions where it doesn't work so well, where it feels like, gee, what were they trying to say there? It's like, you know, everything's fighting each other. I don't really get what they were trying to say there. And sometimes that could be because the writer and the director didn't really see eye to eye, and nobody really had a consensus on what the story was about. That was probably a longer answer than you wanted on that.
Oh no, we love long answers. Thank you so much for getting into that. It sets the stage for the next question that I wanted to ask you, and I also wanted to put out to the audience, which is one, A, have you read a book that's better than the movie? And B, have you watched a movie that's better than the book? So I'd urge the members of the audience to please put down your thoughts. Um, A, have you read a book that's better than the movie version? And B, have you watched a movie that's better than the book? This is in line with the thought of translating books to the screen. When I was talking about it with the members of the NLF team, and I was thinking about it, I realized that for my response for question A was that I'd watched The Lord of the Rings before I read the book. Um, I read the book and I thought it was so much better than the movie because it was just so much more detailed and gives you a lot of room to imagine these landscapes and these characters in your head, sort of added to the pleasure of the reading. And with B, have I watched a movie that's better than the book? I found it really hard to answer that question. But I thought that I really liked the movie of The Invention of Hugo Cabret by Brian Selznick. The book is gorgeous as well. Beautiful full-page illustrations and really nicely produced. But I thought the movie did it justice. But do you have any thoughts on that, Elizabeth?
I did. I agree with you with Lord of the Rings. I love the book, but I also love the movies. And I think, you know, the movies have been adored around the world by people who love the book. So I think that was a pretty successful adaptation. But, you know, a production does come to mind. There was an American novel that came out in the past few years called Little Fires Everywhere. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And there was a production done for Amazon. I think it was 5 or 6 episodes. And it was, I felt, in the adaptation, they just found so much more richness and depth in that story. It was quite remarkable. Yeah, that was Reese Witherspoon has been her production company has been responsible for.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah,
actually, you know, I think I've seen the trailer for this one. I haven't watched it.
It's worth watching.
Yeah, now I will.
Yeah,
I will check it out.
It deals with a lot of issues of race and privilege and all that sort of thing. So it's which the novel didn't really do. Anyway, it was interesting. Yeah.
Nice. We have 2 responses on the chat box. One from a user whose name Faiz Ahan. Have you read a book that's better than the movie version? No. B, have you watched a movie that's better than the book? Yes, Harry Potter. All right. I know that there are team members from the NLF team who feel similarly. I differ, but that's probably just me. We also have Shivali who's responded saying, have you read a book that's better than the movie version, The Suitable Boy? Have you watched a movie that's better than the book, Pursuit of Happiness? Which is also interesting.
Very much so. Yeah. Well, I think Harry Potter, I think that's another win-win. I love them both, all of them.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought I had my share of qualms with the movie, but yeah, I'm just too attached to the book, perhaps. On that question, on that question, Elizabeth, I also wanted to ask you, have you been involved personally or in translating any of your work, any of your books to the screen? I know that you've talked about how your training as a screenwriter has played into how you've written your books and how they're really visual. Have you been involved in moving any of them to the screen? If you haven't, how do you think that would play out? Like you've talked about how the set designers, the people who make the props, you know, all of them add their inputs to the narrative to make it a really engaging production, and that you don't work in isolation. So if you had to translate, or if you had somebody come in and say, you know, I'd love to take this to the screen, how do you think that would pan out? How do you think you would react?
I think I would probably step back as a screenwriter I think I probably, I don't think I would be doing anyone any favors by trying to adapt myself. I think fresh eyes would probably be in order in that case. But no, there are no plans to make either of the books into a film. So yeah, not really an issue for those two books. But yeah.
All right. Okay. We have one more response from a member of our audience, Vinita Mahesh, to the book and movie adaptation question. Vinita says that, have you read a book that's better than the movie version? She likes Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is great as a book, and she likes it more than the movie. And have you watched a movie that's better than the book? She says Wonder. She likes the movie, which she said it's worth watching the movie as much as the book is worth reading. So thank you, Vinita, Faye, Zahan, and Shivali for your responses. On that note, I also now just want to talk to you, Elizabeth, about Blue Gold and about the characterization of Fiona, Sylvie, and Laiping. We noticed that while Sylvie and Laiping are from social backgrounds where they've sort of fallen through the cracks, and Fiona is a really privileged character in comparison to Sylvie and Laiping and even otherwise. So, was there anything specific that guided you in your research to develop Fiona as this privileged character instead of portraying her as having a connection to a smartphone and somebody from who's also fallen through the cracks similarly, like Sylvie and Laiping have? Was it just easier to portray Fiona as a privileged character? Did you want to have different levels of privilege showing up through narrative?
I guess I felt she needed to, as much as she is an individual character and she doesn't bear the weight of any group of people, but she did need to represent the consumer, the end user of the product, who is not aware of and needs to become aware of what's gone into making this cell phone. So that in itself kind of made it easier for her to be a middle-class girl who was, has everything she wants, everything she needs. But I think it was also in my mind two things. One, nothing in Fiona's life could compare to the hardships that certainly Sylvie is suffering or that Laiping is suffering. But I could not possibly have this Vancouver girl compete with Sylvie for hardship, if that makes sense. Sylvie's life has been so horrific. But also, I wanted to show that Fiona's life isn't perfect either. I mean, she's got everything going for her, and yet she experiences something really severe too, very hard. I think I mentioned last time that just around the time I was writing, there were two instances in Canada. I'm sure there are many, many more that didn't get as much attention, but one girl in Nova Scotia on the other side of the country. Canada is a big place. On the Atlantic side of Canada, wound up taking her own life because of online bullying over a photo that she posted. And there was a girl here in the area where I live on the Pacific side of the country who also took her own life because she was victimized by, it turned out, a man in Holland who found the picture online. And anyways, horrific stories. So that's what I was trying to convey with Fiona. But again, because of the severity of the conditions both Sylvie and Laiping were living under, I couldn't have Fiona be a victim to that extent. So that's why I chose to somewhat minimize her story a little bit. I mean, this horrible photo gets out, but she survives it. She finds the strength to survive it. And I suppose I was perhaps trying to do a bit of positive modeling there too, that it's not the end of the world. So often for young people, because they don't have the life experience that adults have, we're in the middle of a crisis, they don't understand that it will pass. The older you get, and I'm quite old, the more you come to understand that bad periods will pass in your life. There is hope. But I think for some young people, they get a bit trapped and can't see that. So I wanted to model somebody in Fiona who has resources, has a strong family, has a strong sense of self that allows her to overcome her situation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We also thought that, on that note, we thought that it might be interesting for the members of our audience to also look at other perspectives on coltan or columbite tantalite. That since that's a core of, it is very central to the narrative of blue gold. And so we were looking it up and we found that the award-winning actor Chiwetel Ejiofor, while he was researching for a role for a play that he was in, he was playing the role of a gentleman named Patrick Lumumba, who went on to become the first prime minister of Congo.
Of
And he was a
course,
beer
yes.
salesman and then he rose to becoming the prime minister. And so while he was researching for the role, he also came upon coltan. And he thought that it was really interesting as to how this mineral is available, but it's so widely available in the country, but it's so out of reach of the people in the country. And so he decided to make a short film about it and wrote an article about his film for the Guardian, in which he says that when he's describing coltan, he says that in the ground it's a metallic ore. When refined, it acquires unique heat-resistant characteristics that make it perfect for use in electronic capacitors. As a result, it's present in nearly every electronic device you can name. Coltan is with us almost everywhere we are, in smartphones, laptops, desktops, computers, games, consoles, but few people have heard of it. And he goes on to say that its story reaches back directly to Congo, where the mining industry has been linked with everything from bankrolling civil wars in the region to the destruction of gorilla habitats. And this is on the next slide. So if the NLF team member could move to the next slide, then our audience would get to read the text as well. In full, Coltan's name is Columbite tantalite, after Tantalus, the figure in Greek mythology, who was condemned to a horrifying eternal torment of the things he most desired being just off his grasp. And he goes on to say, for many people in Congo, which is again on the next slide, that's exactly what coltan is. Close enough to touch, but its riches out of reach. Like copper at the birth of the electrical age, rubber during the era of automobiles, diamonds, for as long as they have been mined, it's a substance that Congo has supplied to other countries, and which, for all the wealth it generates, has turned into a kind of curse. So what we've done, and in his film, he shows two narratives that are happening side by side, where there's one narrative of a soldier in the Civil War who finds coltan with the help of two of his associates, and what does he do with it? And parallelly, there's a narrative going about a young white man in Britain who's pitching a new a new sort of video game that's been developed, which he calls a first-person gaming experience that allows the user to stay within their own version of reality, to create and stay within their own version of reality. And Coltan plays a central role in the development of this game. So what Chiwetel Ejiofor wanted to show was these contrasting narratives where this person who works on the video game has no idea about what has gone before and what goes into the mining of this mineral. So we've got an edited version of the film. It's about 5 minutes that we'll just play for you for the audience. And then we can move into the question about the next question, I think, about voice and culture, which might be a nice addition or extension of this. So if we could have the NLF team play the video, please, of the short film, the edited version of the short film.
Are you ready?
Yes. I'm ready.
Unataka nini?
Napata kitu. Sheha alituambia ya kwamba ilijengwa wakati wazungu wakikuwa hapa, lakini ikazikwa wakati huo mpaka sasa.
Tukiwa na reli, tutaweza shinda hii vita. Tunajua historia yetu hafadi.
Lakini hatukupata reli.
Mlipata dhahabu?
La bwana, hatukupata dhahabu.
there they are in front of me, their rifle straps held carelessly, and I'm roused into this dream to see a world that they have seen. And as I raise my hand to the flag of another country, I wonder, where is my Redeemer? Where is my absolution? What is my gain? I still remember their faces so clearly. The younger one, Patrice. He handed me something so incredibly light. He was the one that handed me my future.
Kapteni, naweza kukuuliza umetoka wapi?
Lisana. Na wewe?
Kasai.
Kwa nini mlinileta hapa? Ni kutojua? Au wewe ni mpumbavu?
Afade, tunataka vita imalizike. Kwa sababu hiyo, tuenda kutafuta ile reli ya mzungu.
And if they saw what I am now, what I have done, what I allow, would they have shot me if they could? Would killing me have made them good?
That's okay. Thank you, sir.
A nutritionist told me onions are bad.
Onions? No onions.
No.
Ni halisi.
I buried Africa that day, as each man has in his own way. I turned as she knelt down to cry and gently prayed that she would die.
Thank you. We can stop screen sharing now. I think what I got from that short film, Elizabeth, was, I'm looking at it, I'm watching it, and I was thinking about what you said about when a screenwriter is clever, they can make inferences about characters from the visuals themselves. And I thought this film does a good job of that. And I would urge the members of our audience to watch the film in entirety, because you really get the flow and the music and the voiceover. They add so much to the narrative. But you're able to infer so much about this character just from these few seconds of him on screen. So it's a really powerful film, I thought.
Very dark. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that also, since we've played the movie and since we have about 10 minutes left for a session, I think we have time for one final question between us before we open it up to the audience. And I thought it was an important question to ask you, and because we've just watched these visuals that have come to us from Congo, it brings me to the subject of our own voices. And during our discussion, we spoke about the debates around the appropriation of voice and culture. While you've gone into the perspectives of other cultures with the two characters in blue gold, you've also attempted to tell the story of a First Nations boy through the eyes of a white boy in the mob in the lynching of Louis Sam. And for the members of our audience, just to give them more context, First Nations is defined as any of the groups of Indigenous people, the Indigenous peoples of Canada, who are officially recognized as an administrative unit by the federal government, or functioning as such without official status. So, on the one hand, there are groups of people who believe that a writer can present a story only if the writer is a member of that particular community and is presenting that community's truth. And this group of people would not deem it fit or would not deem it right for a member from outside their community to write their story. On the other hand, there are people who believe that the story of a community needs to be told in the most authentic way possible, irrespective of where the writer hails from. So, what are your thoughts on this, Elizabeth?
Well, I'm highly sensitive to the issue. I mean, how now having both of these novels transgressed in some people's view, particularly with the first novel, because First Nations rights in Canada are taken very seriously, and it's widely acknowledged that there's a lot that European culture, or settlers, as First Nations would call us, newcomers, there's a lot to atone for. So, for instance, Louis Sam belonged to the Stolo Nation, which is very close to where I live. They're still there. They still have a territory there, and they have a beautiful cultural building, an administrative building, and a library that, in fact, I used to research Louis Sam. But in their culture, my understanding is that family stories are owned by the family, much more than in my culture. A story is a story, you just tell it, but the story belongs to Louis Sam's family. So I knew I couldn't tell his story directly, and I felt as a white person, as a settler, what I could tell was that perspective, a settler's perspective in that particular time. The year was 1884. The area of this happened just on the border between the province I live in is British Columbia, and just south of us is the American state of Washington. And it was only the Washington Territory then. It was just opening up, and British Columbia was just opening up. So there was a particular mindset of the settlers coming in, knowing that they were not welcome by the First Nations. There was fear that motivated, and there was just out and out racism that motivated behaviors. So I could see the story that I could telling it from that white boy's point of view. And he was a real person who there are firsthand accounts of what happened. He is widely quoted. I did take a huge liberty with him. His name is George Gillies, and if anyone ever cares to pick up the novel. He, to his dying day, I found newspaper interviews with him from the 1930s when he was an old man, and he insisted to that day that Louis Sam was a murderer and got what he deserved and all of that. I completely changed that George Gillies has a realization that racism is at work here, and he comes to see the evil that's in his own community that allowed this to happen. So I took liberties. He was a real character, but I took liberties. And sorry, getting a little off topic there, but I felt I could tell that story from his point of view, but I have still been criticized, and I accept the criticism for telling the story at all. And if I were faced with that situation today, one, I don't think I would be allowed to write that book. I don't think any publisher would allow me to write it. And two, I don't think I would write it, knowing what I know now, because there's so much more awareness today than there was then, even 10 years ago.
Thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
I mean, it was still brave of you
Yeah.
to have written the book.
I'm glad I did, because it's an important story, and I'm glad it got out there. But it's highly sensitive, and I have so much respect for those points of view. But, you know, as a writer, generally, no writer wants to be restricted in what they can write about. But there are respectful ways that a novelist or a nonfiction writer or a screenwriter can go about broadening out their community of characters to reflect lots of different cultures and colors, all of that stuff. There are mechanisms in place, sensitivity readers. I mean, you can find somebody from that community to read the piece and say, is this a fair representation? And take those notes seriously when they're presented.
Right.
So
yeah.
I think I think that is a way to allow for creative freedom, but also show respect.
Thanks, Elizabeth. On that note, I think we can open it up to audience questions. I know that we have a question from Vinita Mahesh, who is seeing forward past the conclusion of Blue Gold. She says, you know, if we had to look forward through to what happens to the characters, and because you created them, she'd like to ask you, where do you see them in a few months after the closure of the book? So do you see Sylvie and her family happily settled in Canada? Or how do you see how they're faring?
I
All
do
of
see
them.
Sylvie and her family happily settled. I think perhaps, I mean, I don't mean to be glib or to be dismissive of the immigrant experience. I know it's very difficult for many people, and they've been through so much horrific experience and still suffering from PTSD. So it wouldn't be an easy road, but in my mind, they have loving support from the young doctor that Sylvie met in Congo. She's there. Sylvie's a smart girl, and I think she does very, very well. I think probably Olivier, her brother, I think in my mind, he was probably too damaged without giving away too much of what happens in the book. In the end, we learned that really what he experienced was in its own way, perhaps more horrific than what Sylvie experienced. So I don't have that much optimism for Olivier. Fiona, you know, Fiona has it made from the outset, right? I mean, she'll do great. And I think she probably grows up to, she become an activist like her mother and is spreading awareness and probably does something very worthwhile with her life. Laiping, I don't know. You know, I think I'm least optimistic for Laiping. I think she had the fewest options available to her. I think she probably continued to work in that factory for a few years, perhaps went back to her village, perhaps moved to a different factory. I don't know, but I don't see her really escaping that life.
Right.
So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a question that's come in about how do you hold yourself back and how do you stay objective as a writer, I guess, to some extent, where the question is, you came across as a passionate person while writing this book and your previous book. Did it affect you emotionally? Wherein, how do you hold, like if you feel strongly about an issue, what is the advice that you would share for young writers to keep their activist self out of the narrative and to tell the story of these characters, or how much of their personal emotions do they bring in, their personal beliefs do they bring into their writing?
Interesting. I think perhaps the author of that question is, how do you not be preachy? How do you not be all messagey in your writing? And the answer for me is to focus on these individual characters as real human beings with real reactions, and focus on, live vicariously, be them, see the world through their eyes, and really just leave the message stuff to the side as much as possible, and just have faith that people will get it. They'll get the message, but the most effective way for a novelist to approach these issues is through real characters, characters that we can feel are real, that we feel are whole and fully dimensional.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We have 2 minutes to wrap up, and therefore we have one last question that we can take in from Sudipto Lehri, and a bit point your response to this. That's totally fine. What are the attributes or qualities that can make a novel to be chosen for a screen?
Oh,
shall I say that again? What are the attributes? Okay.
Got it. Well, I think any novel probably can be adapted to the screen. But as I was saying earlier, I think my 2 novels probably are fairly visual, and there's probably a fairly linear narrative development in them that's easy to follow. And there's lots of dialogue, so you can hear the characters as you're reading. Yeah, I've never adapted a novel to the screen, so I don't really know, but that's my instinctive reaction to that question.
All right, so that would be make it visual and make sure that your readers and therefore your viewers can hear the characters as they read or as they view the story.
Yeah.
Would that
But
be an
having
accurate
said that,
summation?
that would be an accurate, absolutely. But having said that, my gut feeling is it would be a mistake to set out to writing a novel so that it might be adapted to the screen. I mean, if you want to write something for the screen, write a screenplay. That's another way to go. Right. If you're writing a novel, enjoy the novel and dig into that format and be expansive and really explore it.
All right. Sure. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think on that note, we will have to wrap up this interaction. Thank you so much for taking the time out to do this with us. This was a wonderful session.
My great pleasure. And thank you so much for inviting me, and enjoyed watching the film too. Very moving. It's just so much more graphic when we see it on film, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. We'll send you the link, and we'll send the link out to all the members of our audience. We've posted it up in our chat box, but we'll put it down in a follow-up email as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you back here at NLF Imaginary Lines 2020. Until then, please do take care, stay safe, happy reading. Thank you so much. See you.